You're shut down.
Take the token, too, Sheriff Nolan Pike said. Men like him hide things in sentimental junk. The breakfast crowd inside Sims' roadside grill stopped eating. Harold Sims stood beside the register with one wrist already locked in a steel cuff. At 63, he still wore the white cook's apron he had tied before sunrise, though a dark streak of bacon grease crossed the front now. His other hand rested flat on the counter, close to a scratched steel lunch token no larger than a quarter. The token had hung from Harold's keyring for 37 years. Nolan pulled it free. Harold's voice remained quiet. That doesn't belong to the county. It belongs to evidence now. The sheriff threaded the second cuff through the token's ring and snapped it around Harold's wrist, trapping the small piece of steel against the chain. Then he raised Harold's hands where every customer could see them. Metal struck metal. A woman in the first booth lowered her coffee. A truck driver near the window stopped halfway out of his seat. Behind the counter, the grill hissed beneath 6 untouched orders. Nolan smiled as though the room had just confirmed something for him. Harold Sims, he announced, you are being detained for disorderly conduct, obstruction, and threatening a responding officer. Harold did not argue. That seemed to irritate Nolan more than anger would have. 20 minutes earlier, an anonymous caller had reported shouting broken furniture and a man with a knife inside the diner. Yet the chairs were upright. The customers were calm. The only blade in sight lay beside a half-cut lemon near the tea machine. Nolan had entered anyway with his body camera blinking red. He had not asked who called. He had not asked whether anyone felt threatened. He had walked directly to Harold. Now he tightened his grip on Harold's arm and pulled him away from the counter. You can explain yourself to the magistrate. Harold glanced toward the wall clock. 10:47 a.m. The review would begin before noon. Once the charge entered the county system, the diner could remain sealed for days. Health inspectors might be called. Vendors might suspend deliveries. The breakfast room Harold had kept open through recession's tornado warnings and his wife's final illness could be ruined by lunchtime. Nolan knew it. That was why he had chosen the busiest hour. Sheriff said a gray-haired customer named Dale, there wasn't any disturbance. Nolan pointed towards the booths without releasing Harold. Anyone interfering can ride with him. Dale sat back, but his phone remained raised above the table. Nolan noticed it. His expression hardened. He dragged Harold through the narrow aisle, striking the edge of 2 tables with the cuff chain. Coffee spilled. A plate shattered near the door. Each sound made the arrest appear more violent, although Harold had not resisted once. Outside, the Tulsa heat pressed against the glass. A county cruiser waited beneath the diner's faded red sign. Nolan pushed Harold toward it while customers gathered behind the windows. Harold paused beside the rear door. The small steel token caught the sunlight between his wrists. Stamped into its surface were 4 worn numbers and a military kitchen insignia almost erased by time. Nolan glanced down at it, then covered it with his hand. It was a small movement. Dale's phone captured it. So did Nolan's body camera. You should have stayed in your kitchen, Nolan murmured. Harold studied the blinking camera light on the sheriff's chest. Then he asked the first question Nolan had not expected. What time did dispatch send you? Nolan's fingers tightened around the cuff chain. The call is on record. I know. For 1 second, the sheriff's confidence slipped. Then he shoved Harold into the cruiser and slammed the door. At the county holding room, Nolan repeated the charges for a clerk while Harold sat behind reinforced glass. The steel token remained trapped against the cuff, leaving a red circle on his wrist. A deputy entered the booking time. 2:06 a.m. Harold watched the wall clock advance. 54 minutes remained before the magistrate review. Across the room, Nolan leaned toward the clerk and lowered his voice. Harold could not hear every word, but he caught 3 of them. Correct the dispatch time. The clerk stopped typing. Nolan noticed Harold watching and closed the file. What happened next would suspend a sheriff, reopen a harassment case, and force an entire county office to explain why a peaceful diner had been treated like a crime scene. But the truth did not begin with the handcuffs. It began 4 hours earlier, when Harold Sims unlocked his diner before dawn, placed the old steel token beside the register, and noticed a black sedan idling across the highway. At 5:12 that morning, Harold Sims unlocked the front door of Sims' roadside grill and stood for a moment in the dark. The diner smelled faintly of coffee grounds, floor cleaner, and the onions he had sliced before closing the night before. Outside trucks moved along the highway in low waves, their headlights sliding across the chrome trim of the empty booths. Harold switched on the sign, then the kitchen lights. He had opened the diner 6 mornings a week for 28 years. The routine rarely changed. He filled the coffee urns, checked the grill temperature, counted the biscuit trays, and placed a small steel lunch token beside the register before tying on his apron. Most customers assumed it was an old key tag. Harold never corrected them. The token had been issued to him when he was 19 during his first month working in a military field kitchen. It had once guaranteed him one hot meal after a 12-hour shift, feeding men whose names he often never learned. Years later, when his service ended, he kept it as a reminder that a meal could mean more than food. His wife, June, understood that. When they bought the diner, she drilled a hole through the token and added it to the keyring. Every morning, Harold used it to unlock the back pantry. Every night, June hung the keys on the same brass hook near the register. After she died, Harold kept doing both. Not because the ritual changed anything, but because some mornings a small familiar action was the only thing that carried a man into the next hour. By 6, the first regulars arrived. Dale Mercer took the booth nearest the window. 2 highway workers sat at the counter. A nurse, finishing a night shift, ordered eggs over medium and asked Harold to wrap an extra biscuit for her mother. Harold cooked without wasting movement. He cracked eggs one-handed, moved bacon before it curled, and knew which customers wanted fresh coffee before they raised a cup. He spoke little, but he listened closely. That was one reason people trusted him. The other reason was that Harold had fed half the county at one time or another. He had sent soup to families after funerals opened during ice storms and kept a jar beside the register for people who were short on cash. The jar did not say charity. It simply read, "Pay next time." Lately, more customers had needed it. Harold did too. The diner's refrigerator had required a new compressor in May. Beef prices had climbed. A road project had redirected traffic for 3 weeks. Harold had postponed paying himself twice, then quietly used part of June's life insurance money to cover payroll. Only his bookkeeper knew how close the numbers had become. If the diner lost even 2 full days, Harold might miss the produce payment due Friday. If the county suspended his food permit during an investigation, the business could fail before anyone decided whether the complaint had been real. At 6:43, Harold noticed the black sedan. It sat across the highway near an abandoned service station angled toward the diner. The engine appeared to be running. Sunlight had not fully reached the road, but Harold could see the outline of a man behind the wheel. Dale followed his gaze. "You expecting somebody?" "No." The sedan remained for 11 minutes, then pulled away. Harold returned to the grill, though the sight of it stayed with him. 2 weeks earlier, a new diner had opened closer to the interstate exit. Its owner, Vince Calder, had bought radio advertisements promising cleaner booths, faster service, and food without yesterday's grease. Everyone in town understood the insult. Harold had ignored it. Then one of his suppliers mentioned that Vince had been asking whether Sim's Roadside Grill was behind on payments. A health inspector had arrived the following morning after an anonymous complaint about spoiled meat. The complaint had been false. Harold passed the inspection, thanked the inspector, and went back to work. He did not accuse Vince because suspicion was not proof, and Harold had spent too many years watching angry men treat guesses like facts. Still, he began writing down dates. At 7:18, he opened a small notebook beneath the register and added one line. Black sedan across highway. Driver unknown. He closed the notebook as the door opened. Sheriff Nolan Pike entered alone. Nolan was younger than Harold by almost 20 years and carried himself like a man accustomed to rooms making space for him. His uniform was pressed sharply. His boots were polished. A body camera rested at the center of his chest, though its light was dark. "Coffee," Nolan said. Harold poured a cup. Nolan did not sit. He added sugar stirred once and studied the diner over the rim. "Busy morning. Steady. Heard you had another complaint." Harold set the pot down. "What complaint?" Nolan smiled without warmth. "Maybe nothing. People call about all kinds of things." "Who called?" "You know I can't discuss that." Nolan reached toward the register and touched the steel token with one finger. "This military." "Yes." "You serve overseas. Field kitchens, mostly stateside." Nolan flicked the token against the counter. The sound was small, but Harold's hand stopped beside the coffee pot. Funny thing to keep all these years. It earned its place. Nolan's smile thinned. Sentimental things make people careless. Harold met his eyes. So does authority. For several seconds, neither man moved. Then, Nolan placed $2 beside the untouched coffee and left. Dale watched the patrol car pull onto the highway. What was that about? Harold returned the token to its place near the register. I don't know yet. At 8:31, the breakfast rush thickened. The grill filled with orders and Harold's notebook remained closed beneath the counter. At 9:56, County Dispatch received an anonymous 911 call reporting broken furniture shouting and a man threatening customers with a knife inside Sims' roadside grill. At 10:02, Nolan's cruiser was recorded 3 blocks from the diner. At 10:04, before dispatch had officially assigned the call, Nolan Pike activated his body camera and turned onto the access road. Harold knew none of that yet. He only knew that the steel token beside the register had begun to tremble from the vibration of an approaching patrol car. The patrol car stopped hard enough to scatter gravel across the diner's front walk. Harold glanced through the service window as Nolan Pike stepped out. This time, the sheriff's body camera was blinking. Nolan entered with one hand resting near his belt and the other already raised toward the customers. Everybody stay seated. The order changed the room before anyone understood why. Forks paused. Conversations dropped. A father pulled his coffee away from the edge of the table so his young daughter would not knock it over. Harold lowered the grill flame. What happened? We received a report of an active disturbance. There isn't one. I'll decide that. Nolan scanned the booths slowly, giving the silence the weight of guilt. Then he focused on the cutting board beside the tea station where Harold had left the lemon knife. Step away from that blade. Harold did. Dale lifted a hand from his booth. Sheriff, that's been sitting there since he opened. Nolan ignored him. He walked behind the counter without asking permission, opened the swinging kitchen door, and checked beneath the prep table. A pan clanged when his boot struck the lower shelf. Harold watched grease smoke rise from an unattended order. You need to tell me what the caller claimed. Nolan opened the pantry, then the refrigerator. They reported shouting damaged furniture and threats involving a knife. Harold faced the dining room. No chairs were overturned. No glass was broken. The only raised voice had been Nolan's. You can see that didn't happen. A quiet room after a disturbance doesn't prove there wasn't one. It was the kind of sentence Nolan used often, broad enough to justify anything, and difficult to challenge without sounding uncooperative. Most people in Tulsa County knew his public reputation. Nolan attended school fundraisers, spoke at veterans' breakfasts, and posed for photographs beside donation boxes every Christmas. He knew which local reporters would print his statements without asking a second question. He also knew how quickly a uniform could turn doubt into obedience. A customer near the door slid money beneath his plate and left without finishing breakfast. Another lowered her phone when Nolan noticed it. Harold understood the calculation. People might believe him privately, but Nolan controlled who was detained, whose business was searched, and whose name entered a county report. Supporting Harold could mean becoming part of the incident. Nolan reached the register. His fingers rested beside the steel token. What's this? You asked me that earlier. Answer again for the camera. Harold studied the red light on Nolan's chest. My old military lunch token. Military identification. No. County property. No. Could it open anything? The pantry key is attached to it. Nolan lifted the ring and examined the keys. Harold noticed the body camera tilt away from the dining room as Nolan's hand covered the lens for a moment. Then the sheriff dropped the ring back onto the counter. I need your business license and food permit. They're framed beside the office door. Nolan saw them. He made Harold retrieve them anyway. While Harold crossed to the kitchen, Nolan moved close to the register and spoke quietly into his shoulder radio. The words were too low to catch, but no reply came through the speaker. When Harold returned, Nolan inspected both documents long after reading them. Your permit expires next month. It renews automatically after inspection, unless there's a public safety hold. There it was. Not an accusation. A warning. Harold took the papers back. Are you placing one? That depends on your cooperation. Nolan's voice remained calm, almost helpful. It was the voice he used when he wanted witnesses to remember him as reasonable. Harold had seen men use the same method in military kitchens. They created confusion, demanded obedience, then punished anyone who asked for a clear order. The difference was that Nolan carried legal authority instead of a clipboard. Harold returned the permits to the wall. "What do you need me to do?" "Start by telling me who you threatened." "No one." "Who called 911? "You said the caller was anonymous." Nolan's jaw shifted. "I'm asking whether you know who might have called." Harold thought of the black sedan, the false health complaint, and Vince Calder's questions about his unpaid bills. He did not speak the name. "I have suspicions. I don't have proof." Nolan gave a soft laugh. "So now you admit someone has a reason to fear you." "That isn't what I said. It's what the report will show." A chair scraped near the window. Dale stood. "I heard the whole exchange." He didn't admit anything. Nolan faced him. "Sit down, Mr. Mercer. You know my name. I know most people in this county." "Then you know Harold doesn't threaten customers." Nolan's smile disappeared. "What I know is that an emergency call came from this location." Harold caught the wording. "From this location." Nolan's eyes returned to him. The anonymous caller was supposed to have reported something happening inside the diner. Nolan had just implied the call itself originated there. It could have been careless phrasing, or it could have been the first crack. Harold filed it away. Before he could ask more, a county sedan pulled into the lot. Deputy Marla Reyes entered carrying a tablet and a sealed evidence pouch. She was in her 30s, direct in manner, with none of Nolan's theatrical patience. "Dispatch said you requested backup." "I requested documentation," Nolan replied. Marla surveyed the untouched booths and the customers still holding breakfast plates. "For what disturbance?" Nolan pointed toward the knife. "Threat involving a weapon." Marla's attention moved from the lemon to the cutting board, then to the bowl of sliced wedges beside it. She said nothing. Nolan handed her the evidence pouch. "Bag it." Harold's voice dropped. "That knife belongs to the diner. It may be evidence of cutting lemons." A few customers smiled despite themselves. Nolan heard them. The private insecurity beneath his polished image surfaced in the tightening around his mouth. He could tolerate disagreement better than ridicule. Even mild laughter made him push harder because authority meant little to him unless everyone could see it working. He moved closer to Harold. "You think this is funny?" "No." "You think being a veteran gives you special treatment?" Harold's hand paused beside the counter. "No. I think it taught me the difference between an order and an excuse." The diner became still. Nolan reached for Harold's wrist, but Marla spoke before he touched him. "Sheriff Dispatch hasn't sent the incident summary yet." Nolan stopped. "They sent it to me, not through the county system." For a fraction of a second, the camera light blinked between them. Then Nolan said the network is delayed. Marla checked her tablet. "All other traffic is current." Harold watched Nolan's expression settle back into place. The clue was small, and no one in the diner yet understood what it meant. But Harold knew one thing now. Nolan had arrived with details Dispatch had not officially given him, and Harold could not walk away, close the diner, or wait for the mistake to correct itself. If Nolan's version entered the record first, every later fact would be treated as a defense against it. The produce payment was due Friday. His employees depended on the next payroll. June's diner was the only thing he had left that still served a purpose larger than memory. Harold placed both hands where the body camera could see them. "Deputy Reyes," he said, "please note the exact time Sheriff Pike says he received the dispatch." Nolan's voice sharpened. "You're not directing this investigation." "No," Harold replied. "I'm making sure there is one." Nolan Pike's hand closed around Harold's forearm. "Hands behind your back." Deputy Marla Reyes shifted beside the register. "On what charge?" "Obstruction." He asked for a timestamp. He challenged a lawful response in front of witnesses. Harold did not pull away. He placed the second hand behind him and let Nolan secure the cuffs, knowing any resistance, no matter how small, would become the only moment people remembered. The steel chain tightened against his wrists. Nolan leaned close enough that only Harold could hear him. "You should have let this stay a complaint." Harold's gaze moved to the body camera. Its red light was still blinking. Outside, another county vehicle entered the lot. Nolan glanced through the window, then pushed Harold toward the office at the back of the diner. "Clear the kitchen," he ordered. "This business is temporarily closed." A cook named Luis stood near the grill with a spatula in one hand. For how long? Until public safety determines there's no continuing threat. Harold knew what that meant in practice. Eggs would spoil. Deliveries would be refused. By afternoon, people online would be calling the diner dangerous, even if no one could explain what had happened. Louise Harold said turn everything off and send everyone home with pay. Nolan gave a dry laugh. You may want to save your money. Harold did not answer. Inside the office, Nolan placed him in a chair beneath the framed photograph of Harold and June on the diner's opening day. June was 29 in the picture, smiling with flour on one cheek. Harold had kept the frame there because she had refused to let him hang it where customers could see. People came to eat, she used to say. They don't need to stare at us looking young. Nolan noticed the photograph. Your wife. Harold nodded. She owned part of this place. She built it with me. Then she probably knew when to keep quiet. Harold's cuffed hands tightened once. Nolan saw it and smiled. That was the reaction he had wanted. Marla entered carrying her tablet. The call summary finally posted. Nolan's attention snapped toward her. What does it say? Anonymous caller. Male voice claimed an armed disturbance at 9:56. Exactly what I told you. Marla scrolled. The assignment was issued at 10:07. Harold raised his eyes. Nolan had entered this diner at 10:05. Marla continued, your unit acknowledged at 10:08. The clock in my cruiser runs fast. The times come from dispatch servers. Nolan took the tablet from her. Network delays happen. Harold spoke carefully. Can the body camera log show when you activated it? Nolan lowered the tablet. You don't get to conduct discovery from a diner office. I'm asking Deputy Reyes to preserve the record. You're under detention. That doesn't erase the record. Nolan stepped between Harold and Marla. This conversation is over. He ordered Marla to escort the employees out while he completed the search. Before leaving, she paused near Harold. I'll note your request. It was not a promise of help. It was enough. The first dismissal came 20 minutes later. A county clerk named Ellen Voss arrived to collect Nolan's preliminary report. Harold asked her to record his request for the dispatch log and the 911 call record. Ellen kept her eyes on Nolan. Evidence requests go through the magistrate. The review starts before noon. Then raise it there. I'm trying to make sure the files still exist when I do. Nolan placed his report on top of her clipboard. Mr. Sims believes everyone is tampering with evidence. That isn't what I said. Ellen took the report without reading it. The system had already begun accepting Nolan's version because it had his badge number at the top. At 10:39, Nolan escorted Harold through the dining room. Customers remained outside the windows. Dale was still recording. Louise stood beside the employee entrance with Harold's apron folded over one arm. Nolan stopped near the register. You forgot something. He lifted the keyring. Harold's steel token hung beneath it. Nolan removed the pantry key, then held the token toward the body camera. Possible concealed tool attached to detainee property. Harold stared at him. You examined it 20 minutes ago, and now I'm documenting it properly. It's a lunch token. It has military markings and altered edges. The edges are worn. Nolan slipped the token into an evidence pouch, sealed it, and wrote, weapon accessory across the label. A few customers reacted aloud. Dale moved closer to the glass. Nolan had transformed a keepsake into an accusation with 4 words from a marker. That was the more personal humiliation, not the cuffs, but watching a piece of Harold's life renamed by someone who knew exactly what it meant to him. Harold's voice remained level. Put the time on the bag. Nolan stopped writing. What? You timestamp every item you collect. The sheriff added 10:42. Harold memorized it. At the holding room, the practical threat became clear. A county notice had already been placed on the diner door. The business would remain closed, pending review of an alleged weapon incident. Harold's food permit was not revoked, but suppliers and insurers would see the notice before they saw any correction. Nolan sat across from him at a metal table. Sign a voluntary closure agreement, and I may recommend release before the review. Harold, read the first paragraph. The agreement stated that he had failed to control a dangerous disturbance and voluntarily accepted responsibility for unsafe conditions. If I sign this, your report becomes true. If you sign it, you go home, to a locked diner. That's your choice. Harold placed the pen down. The partial clue tempted him toward the wrong conclusion. Nolan had arrived before the assignment, so Harold first assumed the sheriff had received a private warning from Vince Calder. Perhaps the rival owner had called Nolan directly, then placed the 911 call afterward to make the response appear official. But the timing did not fit. If Nolan already knew about the supposed disturbance, why had he asked dispatch to alter the time? Why risk changing a county log when a private call could explain his early arrival? There was another possibility. The official record might show more than when Nolan had been sent. It might show that he had never been sent at all. Harold lifted his head. I want the Bodycam dispatch log preserved in its original form, including activation time unit status and assignment history. Nolan's expression changed, only slightly. It was the first confirmation Harold had received. You've been watching too much television, Nolan said. No, I spent 12 years running military kitchens. That makes you an expert on police records. It made me responsible for supply logs. When food went missing, we didn't argue over who sounded convincing. We matched issue time receipt time and the person who signed. The hidden strength was not legal brilliance. It was habit. For decades, Harold had survived by tracking what arrived, what left, and when. Flour deliveries, payroll envelopes, freezer temperatures, medication schedules during June's illness. He trusted records because records could outlast confidence. Nolan leaned back. You think a lunch counter makes you an investigator. I think clocks make poor liars. At 11:14, Marla entered with a folder. The magistrate moved the review forward. It starts at 11:35. 21 minutes. Nolan stood. Good, we'll end this. Harold rose with him. Marla opened the folder just enough to reveal a printed dispatch summary. Nolan immediately took it from her and placed it beneath his report. Harold caught one line before it disappeared. Unit Pike self-initiated. Not dispatched. Self-initiated. The anonymous call existed, but Nolan had moved before the county assigned anyone to it. Harold finally understood the danger. The false report was only one half of the trap. Nolan's response had been prepared before the official system gave him lawful reason to enter the diner. Running would have been easier. Signing the closure would have ended the cuffs at least for the day. Harold refused the agreement. Then he asked Marla to carry one written request into the magistrate room. Preserve the original Bodycam dispatch log. Compare it with the 911 call record before accepting the arrest report. Nolan read the request over her shoulder. You won't get those records before noon. Harold faced him. I don't need every record. The sheriff's voice dropped. Then what do you think you need? Harold glanced at the clock. Just the minute you decided to lie. At 11:34, Harold Sims entered the magistrate room with the steel token cuffed against his wrist. The scene from the diner followed him in fragments. Nolan dragging him through the breakfast crowd, the shattered plate near the door, customers watching from behind the glass. But the county room was colder, quieter, and more dangerous. Here humiliation became record. Magistrate Evelyn Shaw sat behind a raised desk with Harold's closure notice, Nolan's arrest report, and the sealed evidence pouch arranged before her. A clerk operated the recording system. Deputy Marla Reyes stood near the wall. There was no jury and no crowd from the diner. Only Dale Mercer had been allowed inside as a named witness. Nolan positioned Harold beside the defendant's table, then removed one cuff from his left wrist. Instead of releasing the other, he threaded its chain through the steel token's ring again and locked Harold to a floor bracket. The token struck the metal post with a dull click. Magistrate Shaw raised her eyes. Sheriff, is that necessary? Detainee attempted to manipulate evidence during transport. Harold stared at him. That did not happen. Nolan placed one hand on the back of Harold's chair. I repeatedly demanded access to restricted communication records and tried to separate an item from the evidence chain. The token was still attached to Harold's own keyring. Nolan had labeled it evidence only after deciding to arrest him. Magistrate Shaw read the report. This says the object may be a modified tool associated with the alleged weapon. It's a military lunch token, Harold said. Nolan interrupted. He can explain after I present the incident. Harold's chair remained bolted too far from the table for him to reach the documents. The arrangement made him appear restrained because he was dangerous, rather than restrained because Nolan had chosen the image. The sheriff began calmly. He described an emergency call involving shouting and a knife. He claimed he entered the diner and found Harold hostile, evasive, and unwilling to identify a possible victim. He described customers as frightened and the room as recently disturbed. Dale's jaw tightened. Nothing in Nolan's account was dramatic enough to sound invented. That made it stronger. He used small distortions and official language, allowing the uniform to supply the rest. Magistrate Shaw examined the lemon knife inside a second evidence pouch. Was this recovered from Mr. Sims? It was within his reach. Was he holding it? No, but he refused repeated commands to move away. Harold spoke. I moved when he asked. Nolan placed a page in front of the magistrate. Bodycam footage will show prolonged noncompliance. Harold watched the page. It was not the dispatch log he had requested. It was a summary Nolan had written after the arrest. Magistrate Shaw faced Harold. Mr. Sims, you will have an opportunity to respond. Until then, do not interrupt. Yes, ma'am, Nolan continued. He said Harold's military background increased concern because the token might have been altered to bypass restraints. He suggested Harold's refusal to sign the closure agreement proved he did not understand the seriousness of the public threat. Then, Nolan reached for the photograph taken during booking. It showed Harold in his stained apron, one wrist red beneath the cuff, the token hanging from the chain. Nolan slid it across the desk. This is how he arrived at County Holding. The statement was technically true. It hid who had made him look that way. Magistrate Shaw studied the photograph for several seconds. Harold felt June's token pressing into his skin. It had once represented a meal earned honestly after a day of service. Now it had been photographed, bagged, and described as though sentiment itself were evidence of criminal intent. Nolan moved closer to the desk. Given the weapon report, the suspect's resistance, and the risk to the public, I recommend the diner remain closed pending a full investigation. That would take days, perhaps weeks. Harold pictured Louise carrying the folded apron outside. He pictured produce spoiling behind a locked door, workers waiting for wages, and customers driving past a county notice without ever learning what had really happened. Magistrate Shaw read the closure recommendation. Mr. Sims, do you understand that signing the voluntary agreement could allow a faster administrative review? Yes. And you declined? Yes. Why? Because it says I failed to control a disturbance that never occurred. Nolan sighed loudly. This is the same refusal to accept responsibility we encountered at the scene. Harold faced the magistrate. May I ask whether the original dispatch log was preserved? Nolan answered before she could. That request is irrelevant to whether a weapon complaint justified intervention. It is relevant to when you knew about the complaint. Magistrate Shaw lifted a hand. Sheriff, let him finish. Harold continued. The 911 call was recorded at 9:56. The county assignment was issued at 10:07. Sheriff Pike entered my diner before that assignment. Nolan gave a restrained smile. Emergency response does not always wait for a computer entry. Then, the Bodycam dispatch log will show what information you received and when. It will show that I responded to an active threat. Then present it. The clerk stopped typing for half a second. Nolan's smile disappeared. Magistrate Shaw glanced at the evidence list. Is the log included? The Bodycam video is being processed. I asked about the activation and dispatch log. Nolan shifted his stance. The system produces several technical files. They require interpretation. Harold said Deputy Reyes can interpret the unit history. Nolan faced Marla. She was not the primary officer. She saw the summary. Marla's hand rested against the folder she carried. Magistrate Shaw addressed her directly. Deputy, did you review the unit history? Nolan's voice cut across the room. I object to personnel speculation during an initial review. This is not a trial, Shaw replied, and I did not ask you. Marla stepped forward. I saw one printed summary. Sheriff Pike's unit was listed as self-initiated before the call was assigned. Nolan's hand struck the table. Because dispatch was delayed. The sudden sound pulled every eye toward him. For the first time that morning, the calm public sheriff disappeared. Harold saw the private man beneath the uniform, the one who could not tolerate a room he no longer controlled. Nolan recovered quickly. He pointed toward Harold. This is exactly what he has been doing since I arrived. Twisting ordinary procedure into accusations, he baited customers' challenge commands and tried to turn a lawful stop into a performance. Then he pushed the deepest wound. Haida's behind being a veteran because he believes people owe him trust. Harold's breathing changed. Dale shifted in his chair. Nolan lifted the sealed pouch containing the token. This piece of metal is not a medal. It is not proof of character. It does not give him the right to ignore a sheriff. Harold studied the object through the plastic. June had touched that token every night for 28 years. Nolan did not know that. He did not care. He only knew that it mattered and therefore it could be used. Harold could have shouted. He could have told the room about June, the military kitchen, the diner, and every person he had fed without asking whether they could pay. Instead, he remained seated. "You're right about one thing," he said. Nolan paused. "The token is not proof of my character." Harold raised his cuffed wrist. "The records are proof of yours." A chair scraped behind the clerk. The door opened, and a county communications supervisor entered, carrying a tablet and a sealed digital evidence envelope. Nolan's face tightened. The woman identified herself as Carla Benton. "I was instructed to preserve the original Bodycam metadata and dispatch audit before the noon system rollover." Magistrate Shaw held out her hand. Carla did not give her the envelope immediately. She looked at Nolan. "There is a conflict between the sheriff's written report and the automated activation record." The room changed. Nolan reached for the envelope. "I'll review that." Carla pulled it beyond his hand. "No, Sheriff." Then she placed it in front of the magistrate. "The original log shows your camera activated before the anonymous caller finished speaking to 911. Nolan Pike recovered before anyone else spoke." "That proves nothing," he said. "Officers activate cameras during routine patrol all the time." Carla Benton remained beside the magistrate's desk. "Your report states you activated the camera after receiving notice of an armed disturbance. I may have remembered the sequence incorrectly. The sequence is automated." Nolan gestured toward the tablet. "Metadata can lag. Dispatch systems are not perfect." Magistrate Evelyn Shaw opened the digital evidence envelope and removed a certified printout. Each line contained a time, a unit status, and an action recorded by the county server. Harold could not reach it from the floor bracket. "I did not need to." Nolan was no longer dismissing the record as irrelevant. He was trying to explain it before anyone had described what it showed. Carla pointed to the first entry. At 9:52 and 14 seconds, Sheriff Pike's camera activated. The clerk entered the time into the review record. Carla moved to the next line. At 53, his unit status changed from available to self-initiated investigation. Dale leaned forward. The anonymous 911 call had not begun until 9:56. Nolan folded his arms. "I saw suspicious activity near the diner." "Your report says you responded because of an emergency call," Carla replied. "I observed something first, then dispatch confirmed it." "What did you observe?" "A vehicle leaving the area." "What kind of vehicle?" Nolan hesitated. "A dark sedan." Harold remembered the black car parked across the highway before sunrise. The partial clue had not been meaningless after all. Magistrate Shaw addressed Dale. "Mr. Mercer, were you at the diner before the sheriff arrived?" "Yes, ma'am. Since a little after 6. "Did you see a dark sedan across the highway early that morning?" Harold noticed it too. Nolan seized on the answer. "There. Independent confirmation of suspicious activity." Dale shook his head. "It left hours before you came in." Nolan's voice sharpened. "You cannot know whether it returned." "I was sitting by the window." The magistrate studied the sheriff. "What exactly made the sedan suspicious?" Nolan gave no answer. Carla scrolled through the audit. At 9:54, Sheriff Pike manually entered a location note identifying Sims Roadside Grill. Harold raised his head. 2 minutes before the call. Magistrate Shaw repeated the facts slowly. "You entered the diner's name before 911 received the complaint." Nolan moved toward the desk. "That entry could have synchronized late." Carla touched another line. "The server records when information is entered and when it synchronizes." Both occurred at 9:54. Nolan's hand hovered over the tablet. "Let me see the raw system." Carla pulled it back. "This is the raw system." A silence settled across the room, but it was not yet the silence of understanding. It was the pause before people allowed themselves to accept what the numbers implied. Harold spoke from beside the floor bracket. "Play the beginning of the Bodycam audio." Nolan faced him. "This review is not your investigation." Harold kept his voice measured. "The log shows when the camera started. The audio will show what you knew before the call." Magistrate Shaw considered the request. "Then it be played without delaying the review." Carla nodded. "The preserved file includes the first 5 minutes." Nolan stepped closer. "The footage contains protected radio traffic. Then, play only the officer's microphone before dispatch contact, Shaw said. Carla opened the file. The first sound was the hum of Nolan's cruiser. A turn signal clicked. Tires passed over loose gravel. Then Nolan's voice came through the speaker, quiet and clear. "He's open." Breakfast crowds inside. No dispatcher had spoken. The recording continued. Nolan exhaled, then said, "Calder, better make the call now." Dale's chair scraped backward. Marla Reyes lowered her eyes to the floor. Nolan reached across the desk and stopped the playback. "That is taken out of context." Carla removed his hand from the tablet. "You are interfering with preserved evidence." Nolan's face reddened. Calder is the name of a confidential source. Harold felt the cuff chain press into his wrist. Vince Calder. The rival diner owner had not merely complained after Nolan happened to arrive. Nolan had been waiting for the complaint. Still, the audio alone did not prove what Calder told 911 or whether Nolan knew the details would be false. The central record had exposed preparation. The supporting record had to confirm the lie. Harold faced Magistrate Shaw. "Please compare that time with the 911 call." Nolan shook his head. "The caller's identity is protected. I asked for the record, not his identity. The report already summarizes it. The report was written by you." Magistrate Shaw addressed Carla. "Do you have the original call?" The Emergency Communications Office released a certified copy after Deputy Reyes requested preservation. Nolan stared at Marla. "You went outside my command. I preserved evidence after a detainee raised a specific timing conflict. I gave you a direct order. You ordered me not to document it." The clerk stopped typing, then resumed with greater care. Carla opened the 911 recording. A male voice spoke through distortion, claiming that a violent man inside Sims' Roadside Grill had overturned chairs, threatened customers, and waved a large kitchen knife near the front counter. The dispatcher asked whether the caller was inside. "No," the man replied. "I just drove past." The dispatcher asked how he could see overturned furniture through the diner's shaded windows. The caller paused. "I heard it from somebody who got out." "Can we speak to that person?" Another pause. "They already left." The dispatcher requested the caller's name. He refused. Then came the detail that changed the room. "The owner's wearing a white apron," the caller said. "He keeps an old steel military token beside the register. He may grab it when officers enter." Harold felt every person's attention move toward the token hanging from his cuff. That detail was not visible from the highway. It had not appeared in any public record. Nolan had handled the token earlier that morning while drinking coffee. Magistrate Shaw's voice became very quiet. "Sheriff Pike, did you discuss that object with the caller?" "No." "Had Mr. Calder been behind the counter?" "I don't know," Harold answered. "Vincent Calder has never worked in my diner. He would not know where I keep the token unless someone told him." Nolan pointed toward Harold. "That is speculation." Harold nodded. "Yes, so let's use the records." He asked Carla to replay the Bodycam segment from Nolan's morning visit. The camera had been inactive while Nolan drank coffee, but the unit microphone had captured a short, buffered segment from the seconds before formal activation. Nolan's voice was faint, speaking on a personal phone as he crossed the parking lot. "You mentioned the knife," he said. "I'll handle the rest." The call ended. 10 seconds later, the body camera activated. The room understood before Nolan did. He continued speaking as though explanation could still restore the morning. Calder reported a legitimate concern. "I advised him how to describe an emergency accurately. That is not misconduct." Carla displayed the call timing. Nolan's personal phone conversation ended at 9:52. The 911 call began 4 minutes later. Magistrate Shaw removed her glasses. "You instructed a private citizen to report a knife before he placed the emergency call." "I had already told me there was one." "The recording says you told him to mention it. He may have observed it previously." "The knife was beside a bowl of lemons," Marla said. Nolan swung toward her. "You are finished in this department." No, Magistrate Shaw replied. "You are finished directing anyone in this room." Nolan reached for his radio. Carla blocked his hand from the evidence. The magistrate ordered the clerk to contact the county administrator and the district attorney's intake office. She directed Marla to remove Harold's restraints and preserve every original file associated with Nolan's unit, the 911 call, and the diner closure. Nolan's control finally broke. This county will collapse if every criminal can challenge response times and turn a technical discrepancy into a conspiracy. Harold rose as Marla unlocked the cuff from the floor bracket. His wrist was swollen where the token had pressed into the skin. He did not shout. He did not ask Nolan to apologize. He picked up the certified dispatch log and placed it beside the call record on the magistrate's desk. "This is not a technical discrepancy," Harold said. "You chose the place before the call. You chose the accusation before the caller spoke. Then you used my diner, my service, and that token to make the lie look dangerous." Nolan opened his mouth. Harold raised the steel token between them. "You said this did not prove my character." The room waited. It didn't have to. Your own camera proved yours. Magistrate Shaw canceled the closure notice and ordered Harold released without charge. She directed that Nolan be removed from active duty pending an emergency administrative review. Marla took the sheriff's radio. Nolan did not resist, but his face carried the disbelief of a man who had mistaken obedience for loyalty. Before noon, his badge access was suspended. The district attorney's office reopened the anonymous harassment complaints connected to Sims' roadside grill. Investigators would later determine whether Vince Calder had filed the earlier false health report and whether Nolan had helped him target Harold's business. Those consequences would require interviews, hearings, and evidence beyond one morning. But the false charge had ended. Dale approached Harold as Marla returned the token and keys. "You ready to go back?" Harold rubbed the red circle around his wrist. "Not yet." He crossed to the clerk's desk and requested a certified copy of the corrected record. Then he signed one document, the dismissal acknowledging that the arrest and closure had lacked a lawful basis. Harold slipped the copy beneath his arm. Only after the truth belonged to the record did he leave the room. By 12:18, Harold Sims was standing outside his diner again. The county notice still covered half the glass door, but a second sheet had been taped across it in red ink. "Closure canceled. No active public safety violation." Luis waited beneath the faded sign with Harold's folded apron. Dale stood nearby along with several breakfast customers who had followed the review through calls and hurried messages. No one cheered when Harold crossed the parking lot. The morning had been too ugly for celebration. Luis held out the apron. "You want me to fire up the grill?" Harold studied the dark windows. Inside plates remained where customers had left them. Coffee had dried beneath an overturned cup. The broken dish near the entrance had not been swept away. He unlocked the door. "First we clean." The token turned with the pantry key as it had every morning for 28 years. For several seconds, Harold kept his hand on the lock. Then he entered. The customers followed without being asked. Dale picked up the broken plate. The nurse wiped the booths. Luis checked the refrigerator and began listing what could still be saved. By 1 o'clock, the room smelled of soap-hot metal and fresh coffee again. Harold did not reopen for lunch. He paid his workers for the full day, called the produce supplier, and sent a copy of the corrected county record to the diner's insurer. The supplier agreed to hold Friday's payment until the following week. It was not a miracle. Harold was still behind on bills. The refrigerator repair still had to be paid. One canceled closure did not undo months of thin margins. But his business had not been buried beneath Nolan Pike's report. That afternoon, the county administrator placed Nolan on emergency suspension pending an outside review. His badge, radio, and system access were collected before the end of the shift. The suspension was not a conviction. Investigators still had to determine how long Nolan had been communicating with Vince Calder, whether money had changed hands, and whether other stops had been built around fabricated complaints. The 911 harassment case was formally reopened. Within 3 days, Vince's attorney confirmed that he had made the call but claimed Nolan had pressured him into exaggerating what he saw. Nolan's attorney claimed Vince had invented the entire plan and manipulated a sheriff who believed a threat was real. The recordings made both explanations difficult. The investigation expanded to the earlier health complaint and several anonymous calls involving other small businesses near the interstate. Deputy Marla Reyes was interviewed by outside counsel. So was Carla Benton, the communications supervisor who had preserved the original files before they could be replaced during the system rollover. Neither woman called herself courageous. Marla said she had followed evidence preservation policy. Carla said an audit log was useless if people only trusted it when it protected someone powerful. Magistrate Evelyn Shaw issued a written correction stating that Harold's arrest, detention, and business closure had lacked sufficient lawful basis. The order required the county to remove the charges from public search results while the administrative investigation continued. Harold framed no copy of it. He placed one in the office file cabinet and another beneath the register beside his notebook of supplier payments and freezer temperatures. Records belonged where they could be found when needed. 4 mornings later, Sims' roadside grill reopened at 5:12. Harold switched on the kitchen lights, filled the coffee urns, and laid the steel token beside the register. The scratches seemed deeper than before. One edge carried a fresh mark from the cuff chain. He rubbed it with his thumb, then attached it to a new leather loop so it would not strike his wrist again. June would have disliked the damage. She would have disliked the attention even more. At 5:38, Dale entered, carrying a small wooden box. "What's that?" "Open it." Inside was a brass hook mounted on a square piece of oak. Dale had carved 2 words beneath it. "Earned place." Harold read the words twice. "Who made this?" "My grandson did the carving. I supplied the bad handwriting." Harold installed the hook beside the register close to the spot where June had kept the keys. He hung the token there. By 7 every booth was occupied. Some customers came because they had always eaten there. Others came because they had watched Dale's recording circulate through town and wanted to show support. Harold treated them the same. He did not give speeches. He did not place Nolan's name on the menu or turn the diner into a monument to what had happened. He cooked eggs, refilled coffee, and reopened the pay next time jar. When a local reporter asked whether he felt vindicated, Harold wiped the counter before answering. "I feel open." The reporter waited for something stronger. Harold added, "That's enough for today." 2 weeks later, the County Review Board sustained the emergency suspension while the district attorney examined possible evidence tampering misuse of emergency communications and unlawful detention. Nolan was not returned to patrol. Vince Calder's diner remained open during the investigation, but his advertisements disappeared from the radio. Several suppliers stopped extending him credit after learning he had used a false emergency call against a competitor. Harold refused to celebrate that either. A business should rise because people chose it, he said, not because another one was destroyed. The county adopted a new rule requiring supervisors to review every self-initiated response that became linked to a later 911 call. Deputies were also prohibited from personally editing dispatch summaries connected to their own arrests. The reforms were small and procedural. That was precisely why Harold trusted them. One evening, after the last customer left, he sat alone in the first booth with June's photograph beside him. The diner had earned enough during reopening week to cover payroll and most of the produce bill. Someone had left $20 in the pay next time jar. Someone else had added a note for the next person. Harold carried the note to the register and tucked it beneath the token. Outside trucks moved along the Tulsa highway, their lights passing over the windows in slow bands. The grill cooled behind him. The room settled into the quiet that follows honest work. Harold reached for the keys, then stopped. For years, the token had reminded him of the meals he had earned when he was young. After June died, it reminded him of the life they had built together. Now it carried one more meaning. Authority could rename an object. It could rename a man. It could write a lie into an official report and trust that most people would never ask when the story began. But truth had its own timestamps. Harold hung the keys on the new wooden hook, switched off the lights, and locked the diner for the night. The steel token rested beneath the words "earned place." And this time, no one else got to decide what it meant. What would you have done if the person controlling the record was also the person abusing their power? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who refuse to let authority have the final word.